Hello. Hey, so real quick, some people were complaining that I just kind of ramble on during these videos. So here's like the condensed too long didn't watch version. Is the war in Ukraine even happening? I don't know, kind of depends on what you mean by that. All right, there you go. Hope you're happy with the shorter version. Hope it was worth all of those mean comments. Now that brightly colored intro card might give you the immediate reaction of what kind of a question is that? But like most things on this channel, I'm gonna have to ask you to bear with me for a little bit while I explain some stuff. So just delay writing that comment for at least a few minutes. And also, like most of my videos, this idea applies to most things, but I'm just going to stick to talking about things that I know about. So let's set the stage real quick. It's 1991. Saddam Hussein invades the small oil-rich country of Kuwait. U.S. coalition forces stage in Saudi Arabia, ready to defend it if the Iraqis push south over the border. Operation Desert Shield is a go. Bush Sr. gives the green light to storm in Norman. Coalition goes north. Iraqis fall back over the international border. Everyone gets a high five. Mission accomplished. While this is going on in a Parisian apartment, French postmodernist Jean Baudrillard writes 3 papers. Gulf War will not take place, the Gulf War is not taking place, and the highly anticipated end to the trilogy, the Gulf War did not take place. And hearing the title of those papers probably elicits the same response as the title of this video. Now, keep in mind, these titles were purposely provocative.
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
The author in question is not saying that Iraq did not go into Kuwait only to eventually get pushed back over the border. He's not denying that battles didn't take place, tanks blown up, ships destroyed, aircraft shot down, missiles launched, all that stuff. What he's denying isn't the actual conflict, but the idea of the Gulf War is what didn't happen. Gulf War talked about on the news, in the newspaper, in radio broadcasts, and by extension of that, what everyone's idea of the Gulf War is what didn't happen, because that's where they got all their information from. And using that framework, I'm going to apply that to Ukraine. But notice my title is a question, because just as obvious as the similarities are the differences. So let's actually talk about it. We're going to use the 2 main points that Baudrillard brings up in his papers. The first point was the power imbalance of the war, and the second, I would argue more importantly, being the coverage by international media, but because that's the good part, I'm going to save it to the end of the video, mostly so you have to watch mid-roll ads. Now, to reiterate, and also to cover my own ass, I am not here questioning if there is a war going on in the country of Ukraine against the Ukrainians and the Russians. No, I'm not asking if the war in Ukraine is currently happening. I'm asking if the war in Ukraine is happening, if that makes sense. See, Baudrillard argues that the Gulf War was a hyper-real war, meaning it was so perfect a war that there's no way it could have been real, at least from the perspective of the coalition. It was just too good to be true, and that partially comes from the imbalance of power on both sides. Iraq, which was still recovering from a brutal war with Iran, was outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched by a vastly technologically superior force. This, in the author's mind, led to a war that was closer to how militaries trained than actually how we've seen fighting in, say, Vietnam, Korea, or France during World War II. When we conduct live fire training, surprise, surprise, the bullets only go one direction. We shoot plywood cutouts and green plastic targets, neither of which can fight back. Unless you count that one target that won't go down no matter how much you shoot it. Very rarely will you have simulated casualties in these, and obviously you'll win a fight against plastic Ivans and plywood cutouts every single time. Baudrillard argued that this was closer to the fighting in the Gulf. Iraqi tanks couldn't effectively shoot at night and were outranged by American vehicles. Their superiority was almost a given after the initial breakout, and coalition casualties were minimal. So minimal, in fact, that General Schwarzkopf described it as no less than miraculous. More casualties were caused by accidents than actual enemy fire. The Iraqis were, to put it simply, totally swept and pushed back over the border with relative ease. In short, for the coalition, it was a perfect war. A conventional ground fight over large flat terrain that was morally unambiguous with an enemy that had limited retaliatory capacity. The war was so perfect that it wasn't even a real war, maybe a practice war or a warm-up, closer to live fire training we conduct than typical ground combat we've seen in history. Now, of course, this is the biggest difference that we see amongst the two sides in Ukraine and Russia. The war, ever since the initial invasion, has been an absolute slugfest. ATGMs and mines make it difficult for forces to mass armored formations, which are typically needed to break through defensive lines. And now they're being relegated to infantry support. The airspace is still hotly contested. Despite almost a year of fighting, no one has been able to actually secure a solid airspace in which to operate in, which is why you don't see a lot of stuff about planes and minimal stuff about helicopters these days, because the risk of getting shot down is just too high on both sides. Small bits of land are taken and lost, but with heavy amounts of casualties. And as of now, this war has been going on for almost a year and no one's really sure how it's going to end. There's no debating that this is a real war in its most tragic form. And Baudrillard, depending on, what team he decided to pick at his end of days, would either be looking down or looking up upon us and saying, yeah, that sucks. But what would this incorporeal consciousness of a dead French author think on everything else? While he might agree that the nature of the fighting lends itself to a real war, he'd most likely say something like this, but I don't speak French, so I'm just gonna have to figure it out on my own. Arguably to him, what would make him raise the same questions of the war in Ukraine as he did in the Persian Gulf is where they are most similar, and that is in the constant, unending flood of information available. See, the Gulf War was famously the first live war, and while Vietnam was the first televised war, the footage that came out of that had to be first collected and then edited and then sent back to the United States, then edited some more, and then presented by someone else who wasn't even there. So you have all these layers of filters between what actually happened on the ground and then someone sitting on their couch watching it. Every step along that way is a little bit less of the truth that makes it to the end. But now when the 90s roll around, much of that isn't even needed because a camera crew can just sit on the ground and instantly beam up into our televisions what's going on. There don't need to be those steps, and on paper, that's a good thing, right? We're getting closer to what's actually going on. We can see it as it's actually happening. But of course, like everything else, it's not that simple. See, the Persian Gulf War was largely seen to be the cure of what we called the Vietnam syndrome, or basically the overarching lack of trust in both the capabilities and the morality of the military after Vietnam. And the American military knew that defeating a large, organized, conventional force would get back some of that trust that we had lost. And they were also very confident in the outcome of this war. So to take advantage of that, they brought a ton of news media onto the actual battlefield, giving them way more access than had seen before, especially in Vietnam. And again, that seems like a good thing, right? Again, not exactly. See, they were very careful about what they actually allowed them to show. They put them in very specific places with very specific units in order to capture a very specific image. The military was controlling the narrative in this one. So think of it more akin to getting a college tour where the nice person walking backwards is going to tell you about all the cool amenities, how late the gym is open, and what they serve in the dining hall. But they're not going to take you into a dorm and find some 19-year-old on a 2-day bender who's failing all his classes, even though that's probably more accurate as to what you would experience when you went to college. And to add another layer to this, the amount of information from this war is never ending. You could fill libraries with just status sheets of the tires on our Humvees or the shape of the holes that we dug in the ground over there. The fact that there is so much information on this means that there is no way someone can actually consume all of it. No matter how big a slice of the pie that you take a bite into, you're never going to get the whole pie. It's just not humanly possible. And because of this, everyone has a slightly different piece of the pie based on what information they decide to gather, giving every person a slightly different perspective on what happened over there, as opposed to some overarching narrative that we can all agree on. Now we just have to agree that at some point some stuff happened over there. And to a large degree, we're suffering from the same thing with the Ukrainian war. But it's even more complicated now than it was in the 90s. There is still the issue of information being filtered through traditional media methods and a narrative attached, but now there's also more than one narrative. In the Persian Gulf, there weren't a group of Iraqi sympathizers writing hundreds of propagandized articles that found a solid audience in the West, and mainstream media sources didn't need to worry about appearing overly sympathetic to the Iraqi cause by reporting coalition failures. So now you have two continuously diverging narratives straying further and further away from any sense of objective truth, swaying the opinions of millions with competing false narratives. Alright, look, I'm not going like full conspiracy theory here, but this stuff is hard. As someone who has to constantly study and produce usable information from the mountain of data that is coming out of this conflict, trust me, it's not easy sometimes. There's a ton of just blatant misinformation out there, and that's just the reality we live in these days. And a lot of that just comes from the lack of context of the information that's coming out these days, and the fact that anyone can just put a camera up and start talking about it. There's no end to the interpretations of what's going on out there. What I mean by this can be summed up in one clear example. If I were to post a picture of a tank, one comment would say that it's proof of Ukraine's might, another that it's proof of their incompetencies by putting it in an open field, and a third that just says this. Meanwhile, this picture could be a screenshot from a video game. Here's a problem with all of this. There is an inordinate amount of just raw data coming out of this conflict, but unfortunately, just a fact sheet and timestamps of stuff going on is not very useful. Ukraine can move a company of tanks from one town to the other, but what does that even mean? Does it mean they're adjusting mission? What else is in that village? What was in the original village? Is this a reactive measure? Is this a proactive measure? What formation for a larger maneuver? How much ammo were they carrying? How long were they? How long are the adjacent units? Are the Russians? What artillery assets are in the airspace? What's the ground make up? You get the point. By no means am I claiming to be some kind of analytical genius, but if you have no experience in analyzing this kind of data or any military experience to back that up with, it's going to be hard for you to get an idea of what any of this actually means. Because unfortunately, war tends to be the most complicated thing us humans enjoy doing. And if you just hand someone a fact sheet, there's no telling what they're going to pull from it, if anything at all. That data has to be turned into useful information. That information has to be produced by analysts. And each analyst has their own set of biases and probable narrative. And you add more people down the line, and you can see how these filters, again, add disinformation to the people that are consuming this media. Now, having more information is objectively a good thing. There is no debating that. But the downside is that you can build any narrative you want if you're clever enough. You can make the numbers say whatever you want, to put it bluntly. If you really wanted to, you could argue that Russia is going to win the war next week because the torque settings on the wheels of their BMP is higher than the torque settings on the Ukrainian BMPs. And odds are you could probably scrounge up enough data to make that sound like a legitimate argument, as ridiculous as it is. A lot of times people aren't just making stuff up when they present these stories. They're just looking at things in the wrong context, or only presenting what information they want to show and not presenting the information they don't want to show in order to support a narrative, whether it be confirmation bias, some logical fallacy, or some ulterior motive. So back to the question, is the war in Ukraine, is that happening? Honestly, I'm not really sure. I mean, what the hell is actually going on over there? It's hard to say, even for people like me who constantly consume information from this conflict all day, seemingly every day. But I think with a combination of solid open source information, analysts whose entire purpose is to provide useful information and not some other reason, and who are aware of their own biases, the realization that sensationalism gets us nowhere, and the intellectual humility to take in information that might not necessarily align with what we want to happen, I think with all that, we might actually have a good idea of what's going on. But you kind of have to try. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one.